Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here to discuss stories of partition with Aanchal Malhotra, who has been documenting them through objects, through oral memories, through narratives of people who have been through it, of people who have heard about it, of people who have not experienced it. And these have been done through two very extensive works that she has compiled. One was The Remnants of Separation, the second was The Language of Remembering. And Aanchal, when I look at your books, when I read your books, the first thing that comes to me is the fact, the sentence which is repeated so often, and I think you experienced it too. Where is my home? How did that one thing become the crux and the turning point for everything that emerged out of your research and your study over all these years?
Thank you for that question. It's never the first question someone asks me, so it's interesting to immediately be inserted into that. I think this particular question, where is my home, and by extension, why can I not see it again, is the impetus for why a lot of work on partition is done. For many people that left before 47, during 47, sometime after it as well, the absolutely concrete dislocation from one's land was not something they envisioned. So there was always a hope that there would be soft borders, or they'd be able to see their home again, or they'd be able to visit at least. But that never happened. And so for a lot of people, whether you call it not having a sense of closure, or I guess just a sense of longing for where you were born and where your childhood was spent and was severed by a political event, this question, where is home, and why can I not return to it? Is the land I adopted my home, but why do I still feel an emotional connection to the land I left behind? These are very complicated questions. For the longest time, that was shrouded in silence. I think for decades, in fact, nobody talked about what they had witnessed at partition, and least of all, nobody expressed a desire to see where they had come from, because in the, I suppose, in nation building, one of the things that happened to people that became either Indian or Pakistani is that you had to very quickly become a part of that new nation and offer national allegiance in some way. So home became tucked away at the back.
This lack of closure that you speak of, Aanchal, it's very predominant in the lives of people who came from partition. But it has never been part of the mainstream conversation. We've had few books written on it, we've had movies made, but the kind of discourse that we see around, say, the Holocaust, for instance, and the kind of documentation that has happened with the Holocaust, we've not had anything similar for this. And it's only now recently, when the generation that actually experienced partition is, many of them no longer with us, that we are realizing, perhaps with you, with other historians, documentations, even novelists like Gitanjali Shree's book, which did focus on partition, that we need to document this important facet of our history, and we can't just wish it away or close our eyes to it. Why do you think this realization is coming now, and why did we not do it earlier?
I think you're asking the question because maybe people like you and me think about it. But on a national level, I don't think there's enough consciousness about it as there needs to be. Certainly not from the people that witnessed it. The one thing I want to say is that we cannot give a blanket homogeneous experience of partition. We must not think that everyone who lived through partition witnessed the same thing, because people are human, their experiences are different, their consequences of why they moved and how they moved and what happened to them in their towns that they adopted are very different. So we need to understand partition as, I suppose, the coming together of many diverse experiences, be it linguistic, ethnic, geographic, religious, cultural, gender-based as well. The generation that lived through partition, now there are many reasons why silence was their preferred method of communication. If I look at my own family, and who are someone I can speak for directly, the first question, partition is a very unique thing where when you ask a question about it, you will be asked a question back. So when I said to my grandparents, and that too at quite a late age, I think I started writing about partition when I was 23, and I didn't really know anything before that. When I asked my grandparents, what happened? Were you there? And they said, why do you want to know? What will it change? It's a valid question. What would it change? It wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't help them go back to what is now Pakistan. It wouldn't unmake two distinct sovereign states. What would be offered is a kind of generational passing on of that history, which I think is something that has not happened. But why do people stay silent? Why do they refuse to share? Why at the end of their lives do these stories spill out in the manner that they do is something attributed to sheer human behavior. We have no language for trauma. We don't know how to talk about it. How are these stories offered? Are they ever offered? Usually a parent or a grandparent will never start a conversation by saying, oh yes, when I left at partition. And if you are that person who has heard stories like this, then you're very lucky, because you're definitely in the minority. If I compare my grandparents' generation that lived through partition to my parents' generation that were the first after that, my parents say that they never asked anything because it was never made to seem as though partition was a big enough question, like despite the fact that my grandparents lived in refugee camps for 10 years. So I think every generation also perceives the event differently, and only now, coming back to your point of people actually writing stories, only now with the third or fourth generation is there like a real curiosity to record stories, to find out where the origin of our families is, and whether if it's across the border, how are we to gather more information about it, given the political nature of India and Pakistan today and Bangladesh. Sometimes memorialization also skips a generation. You need time. It's not that stories of Holocaust started to be recorded immediately after Holocaust happened. It was the second generation. It was the concept of post-memory. It was trying to make sense of these very unique experiences that people's parents had gone through that then gave rise to certain habits or qualities that their descendants thought they shared. And I think that with partition it has just taken longer because the first generation is the silent generation. And only through some sort of intervention are these stories exhumed.
Absolutely. When you say that the first generation was a silent generation, I'm reminded of a statement that elderly lady made. I did not want to burden you with our memories, with our
my
pain.
grandmother.
Your grandmother. As somebody who is a repository of these memories, how has the process been for you? Because it can be very, very painful and draining and exhausting to be the container for so much memory, and for so many years at that.
That's another question no one asks, or very few people ask. Well, I started recording stories of partition out of necessity because, and it was not that I studied English or history or anything. I studied to be a metal engraver. That's my background. I'm an artist. When I began doing a bit of research on objects that had been carried across the border during partition, really ordinary objects like utensils and, pens and shawls, very ordinary things, I began to understand really that traditional means of narration had failed to do justice to the depth of historical trauma that still existed from partition, how what we learnt about in school when it came to partition was completely incongruent to the kinds of stories people had, why we only think of partition as an incredibly violent event, which it is, but never through the lens of friendships that were severed, or lovers that were separated, or couples that found themselves on different sides of the border, or neighbors that would never see themselves again, businesses that were cut in half, families that were divided. These are never the ways in which we think of partition, because these stories are never told to us, and if they are told in hushed whispers in private places as stories to never be aired out. The need to write these stories was because my generation and I didn't know anything, or I didn't know enough. I didn't know the extent to which partition impacted the country, the person, the family unit, And it really alarmed me that if I knew so little at the age of 23, then the generation that would come after me would know even less. And the rate at which our history is being rewritten in so many different ways, and of course, the very casual forgetting of the past, the sacrifices and traumas of partition would just get buried. You know, so I began recording out of necessity, and at the time, you already know that it's a time-based project because people were in their 80s and 90s. I think the oldest person I interviewed was like 102 or something. But you already know that they are in the last leg of their life, and maybe their memories are altered already, but I think it was really interesting to see how they spoke with such nuance when they did, when they agreed to. And when I began collecting, it was never really about how I felt, because these were stories that had never been uttered. Often they were being said for the first time, they were being asked for the first time. So many people said that we have never been asked this question. Or because my questions were not only like, well, what is partition to you, or what did it feel, or what did you see, how many people did you see get killed? No, my questions were simpler. They were, what was the house like where you grew up? And what do you miss? What do you wish you had carried that you didn't? Things that not only removed you from the center of violence, but also looked at a way of living that had been fractured by a political event that people had nothing to do with. You know how history lives you. So you begin collecting it, 1 month, 2 month, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, suddenly 10 years down, you're this repository of stories, and you don't really realize, but in fact it's made you mature far earlier than you would have. You are caring for other people's anxieties, their fears, their sadness, their longings, their belongings. You're going out of your way to carry packets of soil across the border because someone knows you're from this neighborhood in Delhi that their grandmother came from, or someone knows you're going to Pakistan and can you please get me a fistful of soil from this, bazaar. It's like you become like a palimpsest, right? And there is a heaviness that you don't really know what to do with, but you can't think about because people are still dying and their memories are not being recorded, and you need to do it. Like, I wish I wasn't the kind of person that if someone told me a story, I'd record, because I've never said no. But now, after writing 2 non-fiction books on the subject and engaging so intimately with not just historical trauma, but its generational legacy, I feel really, really weighted. Yeah.
It is a huge weight. It is definitely a huge weight. I've always been interested in how you came about doing remnants of a separation with object memory. How did that happen? What triggered it off?
I was on a sabbatical from my grad program in Canada, and I came back to India. I'd been living in Canada for 7 years, I think 6 or 7 years, and I came back to India to take a break. So I was on a year-long sabbatical. I had a friend who wrote about Delhi, where I live, and he said, your maternal family lives in an old house in North Delhi. Can we go see it? I'd like to write about it. The family had built the house in the 50s after partition. I said, yeah, of course. We go there, and yes, we are talking about the house and all, but my grandfather lives there with his brothers, their families, kids, grandkids. It's like a joint family house, like it's a very big house. My grandfather's eldest brother got out all of these old objects, and they were really ordinary objects. There was bookends and, like little curios and stuff. Out of those objects were 2 things that their parents had carried from Lahore to Amritsar, and those were a yardstick, a ghada, a yardstick that was used to measure fabric in their clothing store, and a ghada used to make lassi, a vessel, very normal vessel. It was like so ordinary that I could have missed them my whole life, which I did. When my grandfather's brother began talking about these objects, touching them, smelling them, tapping them, listening to the metallic clink, it felt like he was transported to the Lahore of his childhood. He began talking about riding a bicycle through the lanes of Shahalmi Bazaar, eating almonds, drinking lassi. It was so innocent and it was so immediately transportive. We all know the ability objects have to contain parts of the past. When you look at something old, you remember your dadi who gave it to you, or your aunt who used to love that object, or when you inherit a piece of, heirloom jewelry or something, you remember the person who once wore it. But I had never seen an object transport someone into the past and across a highly militarized border within a second. And he said something like, it is impossible to go back, so every now and again we visit the past in dreams, which is what a lot of people that are exiled from where they came from, either by political circumstances or otherwise, try to recreate the past. After that, you could say I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was not just the fact that it was such an immediate transportation, but it was also that it was tactile, it was visceral, it was something that a child who doesn't know anything about a place in Pakistan or India can look at and say, oh, this is from that place, tell me more about that place. And I, because I was an artist, I was completely taken by the viscerality and the visual documentation that could come of this. So eventually I went around just asking people what they had carried, and it extended out of my city of Delhi, it extended to parts of India that people had migrated from or to, and then eventually went to Pakistan as well and to the diaspora.
So from objects, and I think objects definitely, because you're an artist, and the tactile and the sensual nature of objects and the holding, the smell, the limbic nature of it all came together in your book, and you used a very unusual form of storytelling in the book. And you brought languages into your second book, but we don't have a single language for Partition. We have a plethora of languages. We have Pashto, we have Urdu, we have Hindi, Punjabi, Sindhi, Bengali, which we don't really talk about. How do you reconcile all these languages into a single language of remembering?
Well, let me ask you something else also, which I noticed when I was doing research. These are languages that we know, verbal languages. But remembrance is not always transferred in verbal language. And quite often when it comes to Partition, there is no verbal language to talk about what you felt. So your language is often silence, which a lot of us inherit. Your language is touch. Your language is emotion. Your language is the passage of objects from one generation to another. So I suppose the argument of the second book is that we are creating an organic language to talk about a historic and traumatic past that has not been done till now, or has not been done in its entirety. That doesn't mean that the language is limited to a particular region. It is a kind of universal language of reconciliation and empathy and listening also, if someone is saying something, the other person needs to know how to listen to that language, how to pick up on the words. So I think what I was looking at was the passage of memory from one generation to another, how the passage of memory from a generation that has lived a historical trauma and a generation that has inherited memories, stories, snippets, heaviness, burdens, longings from it, bitterness, hate, all of that. I was looking at whether Partition is relevant at all. Should we still be talking about it? If we are talking about it, how should we be talking about it? Is there one way to talk about it? And of course, the importance just given to non-verbal language, The cover of my books, my second book at least, has hands on it. And it was just such a strong, like the touch of skin to skin. It has my grandmother and my hands on it. And a lot of times when she couldn't say something, or she didn't want to go into that, she would hold my hand. She would look me in the eye. There were things that you do not wish to share with people, and things that you cannot create in verbal language, words that do not take shape,
Absolutely. You touched upon something very pertinent in your previous reply about should we be talking about Partition. We are celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav with 75 years from independence. How important is it for us to look back at Partition, to acknowledge it, and to put the ghost to rest in some way? in after all these years, how do we as a nation get the closure that we went through this traumatic event? We cannot brush it under the carpet and move on from here.
It is not a single country's closure to go through, firstly. We can't do anything on our own. And by creating national days of memorialization, it could have been a way to enter into further reconciliation with 3 countries that were impacted by partition, but by itself, we can't have closure to partition. You know, firstly because there hasn't been enough discussion around partition to have closure around partition. But if you look at the 3 countries partition, or rather 4 countries partition impacted, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh and Britain, partition means different things for different people. The year 1947 was, of course, partition for Britain, end of colony. For Pakistan, it was independence. For India, it was interesting. India is so large, geographically vast, that the North sees partition, the South sees independence. And for Bangladesh, 71 plays a far larger role than 47 does. So the basic question is, if the 4 nations that the event impacted do not have a single outlook at how to talk about it, how to look at it, how to understand it, then how do we move past it? I also want to say that yes, 75 years have passed and a lot of people are talking about things like truth and reconciliation as they happened in different parts of the world, but those words come in an order. There is truth and then there is reconciliation. With an event like partition, where there are manifold truths, not just between the 3 nations but within them as well, there are so many different versions of what happened, and only by listening to them in their entirety will we be able to gauge the sheer magnitude of what partition really did and continues to do to people. Will we really make way for any kind of reconciliation? But again, one country cannot do it on its own.
So hopefully someday, soon.
I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime. I'm just realistically speaking. Because if any project of reconciliation needs to happen, it needs to happen with empathy. The government needs to listen, you know, with empathy to stories of partition to be able to look beyond it.
Absolutely. So we live in hope always. I live in hope always. Someday, sometime. There is something interesting that you mentioned, that 1971 was much more important for Bangladesh than partition 1947 itself. Could you tell us a bit more about the people in your book who have been through 47 and then 71, and how both these events were like a double trauma for them?
Such a great question, and I will do it by an example of an interview. I interviewed a young woman, my age, probably mid-30s, living in America of Pakistani descent. And we were talking about how partition impacted her family. Her family went from parts of India, UP and Calcutta, to what became East Pakistan in 47. And then further, at 1971, they migrated to West Pakistan or Pakistan proper, and further then to the West, becoming part of the diaspora. Now, we had like 1 hour conversation about this, or 2 hours, maybe something like that. And at the end, I was kind of just going through the years and saying, this is what happened, okay, this, can you confirm that this is right? So I said, in 47, your grandparents moved from India to East Pakistan. And then she says, yes, and you know, my parents also met because of partition. I said, what do you mean your parents met because of partition? You're in your mid-30s, your parents can't be older than my parents. They met in 47 because of partition. She says, no, they met in 71 because of partition. And for a minute, I was like, what do you mean they met in 71 because of partition? And it took me a minute because I am Indian. And for me, 1971 means one thing. And for her as a Pakistani, it is a second partition. It is a second partition. So I remember saying to her, and also writing, I said, of course, 1971 for you is a second partition. And she looks at me and she says, well, what do you call it? I said, I call it the third India-Pakistan war. You know, So what I'm saying is, it's not only, firstly, there's so many like things to unpack in this very small conversation, but the fact is that there were countries that had multiple migrations, particularly on the eastern side of the border, that continued from before 47 till the 90s. There were migrations at 47, migrations at the riots in 64, migrations during the war of 65, migrations in 71, migrations all the way until the riots in the 90s. And so events in one part of the subcontinent would impact migration in a very different part. So that kind of porosity of migration and porosity of the border compared to the western side is very interesting, which also, you know, you asked earlier, you mentioned that Bengal isn't talked about so much. We can discuss that as well. But there were families that went through multiple migrations and carried those multiple wounds, scars, memories with them that are generationally quite difficult to inherit. And even if you do manage to hear them, given the context of the politics at the time that they happened, they mean different things. You know, so this is like a humorous conversation I had with someone, because I saw how history has meted out different versions to different sides of the border, but it's quite serious actually. You know, it's the same as saying we don't have one way to look at partition. Even 71 is the same thing, right?
Absolutely. There's no one way to look at 71, especially given the context of. I'm going to ask you something.
Fresher as well, like it's more recent.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask you something not related so much to the content, but more to your process. What was your process like in documenting these stories? It was definitely very extensive. Could you tell us how did you go around recording these oral testimonies?
It was haphazard, I guess, because I'm trained as an engraver. I had no formal training as a historian or archivist or collector of any sort. So it was basically learning on the job to be an oral historian. And it started off, and how does someone so young actually meet people who are so old? I was early 20s. I needed to speak to people who were at least in their 80s so that they would have been children to remember things at the time of partition. So I went to my grandparents and they would say, okay, well, they know somebody or they know somebody. So every person I would speak to would have some sort of connection to me, like, you know, from one would tell me another one, and I would build a kind of, and I think of it as like building a web, but also building a family over many, many years. The interview process, and of course in Pakistan it was totally different because I went not knowing a single person. I was 24. I went by myself for the first time. I applied to be a short-term researcher at the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, who then put me in touch with people who had migrated from India, who were willing to speak to an Indian about what had happened. And there were many, the subject is delicate, and there are many things that you need to learn to keep in mind. You need to negotiate with while you are speaking to the person. You need to unlearn or realize that you may have preconceived prejudice or bias about something that you've been raised with. And basically every interview leaves you quite transformed. The interviews happened in multiple languages with multiple ethnicities, after which you come and you transcribe, which is probably the point in which you're really listening to what people have said, because at the interview you're trying to get them to speak as much as or as little as they want to speak. When it's just you and the voice and you're listening and transcribing, that's really the time that I remember thinking to myself, God, what have I heard? Or how did people do this to one another? Because it's just you and the voice, and you can listen to the intonation, and you can listen to when they switch language, or when they laugh, or when they cry, and you can tell that this memory means a lot to people, and you are receiving this memory as a privilege, right? So you transcribe, you translate to English, and the process was always very collaborative for me of writing. So after I write down anything, I will always share it with interviewees, and you know, they were quite old, so they would share it with their families, and we would have discussions. And so it's also an ethical practice, you know, so everyone knew what was going to go in books before it was there. But the Yeah, the research is extensive because you're also trying to build patterns of memory from places, right? You're trying to say that even within this group of interviews from Punjab or with Punjabis, there are so many differences. Or look at the difference between interviews from Punjab, from Bengal, from Kashmir, from Hyderabad, from Sindh, Rajasthan, Gujarat, UP, Bihar, Bangalore, Karachi, Chittagong. You're trying to show diversity as well as similarity at the same time.
Absolutely. And after you've done these 2 books now, Aanchal, it's been 10 years, as you said, that you put of your life into these books. What is the one thing that has come out of this? A realization that has been common to most of the people you've spoken with? The longing, of course, to go back, but anything that strikes you that has been universal with everyone?
The hugely adaptable nature of humans. You know, it sees no ethnicity, no religion, no geography. If you are put in a circumstance, you will try to find a way to make it better, which a lot of people were forced to do, right? So I think it's like, I'm amazed at the kind of incredible adaptability humans have. Yeah.
I've often wondered with situations around the world with global conflict and internal uprisings, it's often one enemy against the other. Maybe it's the state, maybe it is a war, maybe it's an invader. But here the enemy was no one else but perhaps your neighbor, a friend, somebody who was your saga, your biradar. Is that why we haven't been able to speak about it as much as we should have or document it? Because, the pain is not so much that another has done this to you, but that someone of your own has traumatized you so much. Would you feel that?
That may be one aspect, absolutely. The aspect of shock and dismay that someone that you know so deeply may have betrayed you. But there are enough stories of the opposite end also, which is why I say there's no one homogeneous way to talk of partition, and to tell a single partition story is dangerous actually, because it lumps all sorts of these incredible diverse people into one category, into one experience, where your memory is contingent on your experience, which may be very different from your neighbor. But yeah, I've heard this many times, that we couldn't believe that our neighbor did this, or the converse, which is we couldn't believe that others did this and our neighbors hid us, or they helped us. So yeah, there all sorts of stories are to be heard.